Story 1. When I first moved into my new house, it felt like a fresh start. After years of renting cramped apartments, I finally had a place to call my own. It was a small, cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, not fancy, but it was mine. The pride and excitement I felt were hard to describe. The street was lined with beautiful old trees, and most of the houses were occupied by families or older couples who had lived there for decades. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other from their porches, kids played in the yards, and life seemed peaceful. I believed I had finally found a sanctuary. I spent my weekends working in the yard, getting to know the neighbors and settling into a comfortable routine. The house next door had been vacant when I moved in, so I had no one living beside me until one day, I noticed a moving truck pull into the driveway. A man, probably in his early 50s, stepped out of the truck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and hard eyes. He looked like someone who had spent years working with his hands. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that made me uneasy. He didn't wave or smile when he noticed me watching from my window. He simply looked in my direction for a moment before heading inside. At the time, I didn't think much of it. After all, people moved in and out of neighborhoods all the time. But something about his cold, distant stare stayed with me. It was a couple of weeks later when I had my first real interaction with him. I was out in my yard, trimming the bushes along the fence, when I noticed him standing on his porch, watching me. He didn't say a word, just stood there, arms crossed, his eyes following my every move. "Hey," I called out, trying to break the tension with a friendly smile. "How's it going?" At first, he didn't respond, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "You live alone?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, just me." He nodded again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's good," he muttered. "Easier that way." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I forced a laugh and went back to trimming the bushes. But for the rest of the afternoon, I felt his eyes on me, even after he had gone back inside. It was unsettling, like he was studying me, waiting for something. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the weeks passed, the neighbor, whose name I later learned was John, became more and more unpredictable. At first, I would see him pacing up and down his driveway at odd hours of the night, muttering to himself. He would leave his trash cans out for days after collection, sometimes tossing random objects into my yard. I even caught him standing by the fence one early morning, staring at my house. But it wasn't just his bizarre behavior. There was something darker, something more threatening about him that began to seep into my daily life. One night, I came home to find my mailbox smashed. It had been fine when I left for work, but now it was crumpled as if someone had taken a bat to it. I couldn't prove it was John, but my gut told me he was involved. Things escalated. Late at night, I would hear him outside shouting incoherently at someone, though I never saw anyone else. Sometimes it sounded like he was arguing with himself, his voice swinging between low mutters and harsh screams. I told myself I would confront him, try to calm things down, but every time I thought about it, the memory of his cold, calculating stare stopped me. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I didn't want to find out. The final straw came one Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, trying to enjoy a quiet day, when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. I looked up and saw John standing in his yard, a beer bottle in one hand, the remains of another lying broken on the ground between our houses. "What's your problem?" he shouted, his voice slurred with anger and alcohol. "You think you're better than me, huh? Sitting there pretending you don't see me." I froze, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. John staggered closer, his face twisted in fury. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled. "I see the way you look at me. You think I'm some kind of freak, don't you?" Every instinct told me to get inside, lock the doors, and call the police, but I was rooted to the spot. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I don't want any trouble. Let's just forget about it, okay?" For a moment he stood there, his fists clenched, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, he backed off. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, turning away. "Forget about it." But I knew it wasn't over. After that day, I lived in constant fear. Every time I left the house, every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting John to appear out of nowhere. The shouting didn't stop. Late at night, I would hear him outside screaming my name, daring me to come out and face him. One night, I woke to the sound of pounding on my front door. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator assured me officers were on their way, but the pounding stopped before they arrived. The police could do little without evidence. A few weeks later, the tension reached a breaking point. John smashed the window of my car with a brick. That was it. I called the police, who arrested him for property damage. But I knew it wasn't the end. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I couldn't stay. The next morning, I put my house up for sale. It took months, but I finally left. Even now in my new home, I can't trust my neighbors, and I don't think I ever will. When my wife and I moved into our new house, it felt like a dream come true. It was a charming 2-story home, exactly what we had been looking for. The neighborhood was perfect, friendly neighbors, clean streets, and plenty space to start a family. The first few weeks were a blur of unpacking, meeting the neighbors, and settling into our new life. Everyone seemed welcoming, and we quickly felt at home. Among the neighbors, one person stood out: Mrs. Hathaway, an elderly woman who lived next door. She was a bit overbearing, but seemed sweet enough. On the day we moved in, she came over with a casserole and introduced herself with such enthusiasm it bordered on excessive. "I've lived here for over 30 years, she said in a high-pitched, breathy voice. "I've seen families come and go, but I always make sure to welcome the new folks. If you ever need anything at all, just let me know." My wife and I exchanged polite smiles and thanked her for the casserole. At first, it seemed like a kind, neighborly gesture. But over the following days, Mrs. Hathaway became a constant presence in our lives. Every time my wife stepped outside to water the plants, check the mail, or even take out the trash, there she was. She would wave, call out to us, or offer unsolicited advice on everything from gardening to home repairs. At first, it was harmless, even endearing, but it soon started to feel invasive. It was as though she always knew what we were doing and was determined to involve herself in our lives. A few weeks after we moved in, her visits became more frequent. She started showing up at odd times, sometimes early in the morning, other times late at night. She would knock on the door uninvited, bringing over random items: freshly baked cookies, gardening tools, magazines. At first, we thought she might just be lonely, but then came the night she knocked on our door at nearly 10 p.m. My wife and I had just settled down to watch a movie when the sudden knock startled us. I opened the door to find Mrs. Hathaway standing there, holding a basket of muffins. "I thought you might like these," she said, smiling sweetly. There was something unsettling in the way she looked at me. I forced a polite smile and thanked her, though I couldn't hide the irritation in my voice. My wife shot me a look, and I knew she felt the same. Her visit felt intrusive, especially at such a late hour. After she left, my wife sighed. "This is getting a little weird, right?" I nodded, concern knitting my brows. She's just being friendly, I guess. But showing up this late, it's strange. Over the next few days, her visits continued. Sometimes she would knock just to ask if we needed anything. Other times, she'd drop off random trinkets like old books or small decorations. It wasn't the gifts that bothered us, it was the relentless, uninvited attention. One Saturday afternoon, my wife and I were outside working in the garden. As usual, Mrs. Hathaway was sitting on her porch, watching us. Every time we glanced her way, her eyes were fixed on us, unblinking. My wife leaned closer to me and whispered, "She's creeping me out." I couldn't take it anymore. Something about her felt off, like she was trying too hard to insert herself into our lives. We decided to start keeping our distance, responding to her visits with polite but firm boundaries. But it didn't work. One evening, we came home to find Mrs. Hathaway standing in our backyard. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking around as if she owned the place. I froze, unsure of how to react. My wife gripped my arm tightly. "What is she doing here?" she whispered, fear lacing her voice. I stepped outside, trying to stay calm. "Mrs. Hathaway, what are you doing?" She turned to me, her smile wide and unsettling. "Oh, I was just checking on the garden. I thought you could use some help with those roses." My patience snapped. "You can't just come into our yard like this," I said, my voice firm but steady. "We appreciate your help, but this is our home. You need to respect our privacy." For a moment, her smile faltered, her eyes darkened, and her expression became unreadable. But just as quickly, she recovered, her sweet smile returning. "Oh, I didn't mean any harm, dear," she said softly. "I just want to help." That night, my wife and I talked for hours. We didn't want to be rude, but her behavior was crossing a line. It wasn't just friendly anymore, it was invasive, almost controlling. We decided to set firmer boundaries. The next time she came over, I made it clear that while we appreciated her kindness, we needed our space. She nodded and smiled, as always, but the visit stopped. Or so we thought. A few days later, my wife came to me, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. She led me to the living room where she had been dusting the shelves. Hidden behind a stack of books was a small, old-fashioned camera. I stared at it, my mind racing. Where did this come from? "There's more," she whispered, barely audible. She showed me 2 more cameras, one hidden in the kitchen, the other in the hallway. They were tiny, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. My stomach twisted. Mrs. Hathaway had been in our house. She had planted cameras. Without saying another word, I grabbed the cameras and stormed next door. I banged on her door, my anger boiling over. When she opened it, I held up the cameras, my hands shaking. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. Her expression didn't change. She didn't look surprised or concerned. She just smiled, that same unsettling smile. "I was just looking out for you," she said calmly, "making sure you were safe." "You were spying on us," I shouted, unable to believe her audacity. She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "I care about you, dear. I'm just trying to protect you." I didn't say another word. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding. Back inside, I called the police. The police took my statement, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest her. Without proof that she had placed the cameras, there was nothing they could do. Mrs. Hathaway stopped visiting after that, but we could still feel her presence. Every time we went outside, we saw her watching us from behind her curtains. One night, my wife woke up screaming. She swore she saw someone standing in the doorway, but when I checked, no one was there. That was the final straw. The next morning, we packed our bags and left. We sold the house a few weeks later and never looked back. Even now, I still don't know what Mrs. Hathaway's intentions were, and I don't want to know. But her obsession left us shaken, and I'll never forget how she turned our dream home into a nightmare. I had lived in my house for about a year before I started noticing things that didn't seem quite right. At first, it was nothing obvious, just small, easy to dismiss details. I would come home from work and find the blinds in the living room slightly open, even though I was sure I'd closed them before leaving. Sometimes the kitchen light would be on, even though I distinctly remembered turning it off. I chalked it up to forgetfulness. After all, working long hours and living alone could make anyone a bit absent-minded. But as time went on, the small, unexplainable events began to pile up. One evening, I returned home after a particularly long shift to find my front door slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just enough to send a chill down my spine. I stood on the porch, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that I might not have pulled it shut properly. My neighborhood was quiet and safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my neck. I pushed the door open cautiously and stepped inside. The house was silent, exactly as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, but that lingering sense of unease wouldn't go away. I double-checked the locks on every window and door and reassured myself it was probably just fatigue. Perhaps I had rushed out that morning and forgotten to lock up. But then it happened again, just a few days later. This time I was certain I had locked the door. I remembered turning the deadbolt before leaving for work. Yet when I came home that evening, the door was unlocked. My heart sank. I stood frozen on the porch, staring at the door, my pulse quickening. Trying to stay calm, I stepped inside and checked each room, listening for any sound, any hint that someone might still be there. Everything seemed in order, except for one unsettling detail: the kitchen drawers were open. Not all the way, just slightly, as if someone had rifled through them and then half-heartedly pushed them closed. There was no way I'd left the drawers open. I always made a habit of shutting them after use. Someone had been in my house. As the days went by, the strange occurrences continued. I would come home to find chairs pulled out from the dining table, books moved from their usual spots, or the shower curtain drawn back when I was certain I had left it closed. It was as if someone was going through my things but never taking anything, just disturbing the order of my home. My unease grew into paranoia. I started triple-checking the locks before leaving the house. I closed every window, drew the curtains tight, and even began placing small objects in strategic positions to see if anything had been moved. It wasn't long before I began to suspect my neighbor Frank. Frank lived next door, and while he seemed friendly enough at first, there was something about him that always felt a bit off. He was constantly outside, either tinkering in his garage or sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood. His small talk often felt intrusive, like he knew more about me than he should. He would casually mention when I left for work, when I came home, or even when I had guests over. At first, I thought he was just a nosy neighbor. But as the unsettling incidents continued, I started to believe he was involved. One evening, I came home to find the lights in my bedroom on. I never left them on, not even by accident. My heart raced as I walked through the house, checking each room. Everything appeared to be in its place, except for one strange item on my nightstand, a small keychain with a tiny flashlight attached. It wasn't mine. I hadn't bought it, and I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. I stared at it, my mind racing. How had it gotten there? Anger surged through me. I grabbed the keychain and marched over to Frank's house. He was, as always, sitting on his porch, sipping a beer. "Evening," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Everything okay?" I held up the keychain, my hands trembling. "Did you leave this in my house?" His face remained blank for a moment before he chuckled. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Someone's been in my house," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And I think it's you." Frank raised his hands in mock surrender. "Who, calm down. I don't know what's going on in your house, but it sure as hell isn't me. Maybe you're just forgetting things. Stress can do that, you know." I wanted to believe him, but the smirk on his face and the way his eyes lingered told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I bought security cameras and installed them around the house. I was determined to catch whoever was sneaking into my home. For a few nights, everything was quiet, no signs of entry, no moved objects, nothing. I started to relax, thinking maybe I had scared Frank off with my confrontation. But then, one night, the motion detector on the cameras went off. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, waking me from a light sleep. I grabbed it, my heart racing as I opened the app to check the footage. The grainy video feed showed the side of the house, dark shadows stretching across the lawn. And then I saw him, Frank. He was crouched near the side window, fiddling with the latch, trying to open it. My stomach twisted in fear and anger. I dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained what was happening. As I spoke, I watched Frank finally push the window open and slip inside. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept down the hallway, my heart hammering. I could hear him rummaging through the kitchen drawers. Without thinking, I swung the bat. It connected with a sickening thud and Frank crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. The police arrived within minutes, pulling Frank to his feet and slapping handcuffs on him. As they led him to the squad car, he glared at me with cold, calculating eyes. The officers reviewed the footage, confirming what I already knew: Frank had been breaking into my house for weeks, maybe longer. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering. Even after his arrest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My home, once a place of safety, now felt like a prison. I moved out a few months later, unable to bear the memories of Frank and his violation of my space. I found a new place in the city where I could disappear among the crowds. But even now, I can't let my guard down. I check the locks 3 times before leaving, scan my security cameras every night, and double-check every shadow. The unease he left behind hasn't faded, and I'm not sure it ever will. Moving into my new place had me excited. It was within my budget, had a small backyard, and was nestled in a peaceful neighborhood. The house wasn't big, but it felt like a step forward, a fresh start. I spent the first few weeks unpacking, decorating, and settling into a routine: work, come home, relax, repeat. For a while, it was all I had ever wanted. But then I noticed him. My neighbor, an older man who lived directly across the street, was always around. Whenever I pulled into the driveway after work, he was there, sitting on his porch or standing in his yard. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was retired or simply liked spending time outside. But then I realized something strange. No matter what time I came home, early in the morning, late at night, or on weekends, he was always there, watching. At first, I tried to shrug it off. People can be quirky, right? Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he didn't realize how unsettling his behavior seemed. But as the days passed, his constant presence began to gnaw at me. The first time I mentioned it to a friend, they laughed. Old people get bored, they said. He probably just doesn't have anything better to do. When I wanted to believe that explanation, so I tried to ignore him. But his unwavering gaze became harder to dismiss. One evening, after a long day at work, I pulled into the driveway as the sun was setting. He was sitting on his porch. As usual, a cup of coffee in his hand. I pretended not to notice him as I got out of my car, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked to the front door. Something about his stare felt different that day, more focused, more intense. I glanced over my shoulder, just to confirm my suspicion. He was standing now. I froze, my heart beating a little faster. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his eyes locked on me, his expression blank. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But even inside, the discomfort lingered. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. It wasn't just the constant watching anymore. I began noticing things in my yard that were out of place. The garden hose moved from where I'd left it. Footprints in the dirt near the side of the house. The back gate left open when I was certain I had closed it. One Saturday morning, I was mowing the lawn when I felt that familiar prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the edge of his driveway, watching me again. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned off the mower and walked to the edge of my yard. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my tone light. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't respond. He just stood there staring. "Look," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "I've noticed you watching me a lot. Is there a problem?" Still, he said nothing. The silence was suffocating. Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked back into his house without a word. I stood there, dumbfounded, my heart racing. It was as though I didn't exist to him, like I wasn't even worth acknowledging. From that point on, I avoided my front yard. I spent more time indoors, keeping the blinds closed and only going outside when necessary. Every time I pulled into the driveway, I scanned his porch, bracing myself for the inevitable sight of him sitting there watching. Things got worse one night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. It was late past midnight and the house was silent. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, the soft crunch of gravel like someone walking along the side of the house. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone, hands trembling. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I pulled back the curtains. At first I thought the yard was empty. The faint glow of the streetlights cast long shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw him. He was standing in my yard. I gasped, stumbling backward and dropping my phone in my panic. He was right there, less than 10 feet from my window, just standing there, watching. I scrambled to pick up my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. "There's someone in my yard," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My neighbor. He's outside watching me." The operator assured me that officers were on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. I stayed in the corner of the room, clutching my phone, my eyes locked on the window. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the yard but found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing to prove he had been there. I knew what I had seen, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. The next evening, I came home late from work, exhausted. I parked in the driveway, dread creeping over me as I glanced at his house. The porch light was on, but he wasn't there. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe tonight would be different. Then I saw it. On the kitchen table where I always left my keys was a note, a small, crumpled piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I froze. I hadn't left anything on the table. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting, almost childlike in its messiness. "I see you." My breath caught in my throat and I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. How had he gotten in? How long had he been in my house? I grabbed my phone and called the police again. That night I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house another moment, not with the constant feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I stayed with a friend for a few weeks while I looked for a new place far away from that neighborhood. I never saw my creepy neighbor again, but the memory of his cold, unblinking stares never left me. Even now, I check my locks 3 times before going to bed. I keep my curtains drawn and my lights on, because sometimes the scariest threats aren't from the things you can't see, but from the things you can. I bought a vacation mobile home nearly 2 months ago. It's a small place with 2 tiny bedrooms, a modest living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The property spans 2 acres, offering ample space and peace, a perfect getaway from the city. One of the best things about this location is its proximity to a mountain I visit a few times a year for snowboarding. During my first weekend there, my family helped me decorate the place. We shopped for furniture at a local outlet and managed to set everything up quickly, thanks to my dad's pickup truck. While we were unloading furniture, a man approached us. He introduced himself as Dale, my closest neighbor. He had a thick Hudson Valley accent and a demeanor that felt out of place to me as someone used to city life. At first, Dale seemed friendly. He lingered around, making small talk while we worked. Eventually, he bid us goodbye and walked back to his home down the road. 2 weeks later, I returned alone to bring more belongings and set up the Wi-Fi. Dale must have seen my car because he knocked on my open door shortly after I arrived. I invited him in, and after some casual conversation, he invited me over for a beer. Feeling neighborly, I accepted. Dale's mobile home was slightly larger than mine, and we sat on his deck as he handed me a beer. I tried to get to know him by asking about Al's life. His responses were laced with pessimism, and he joked about living there for 20 years too long. Then the tone shifted when he asked where I was from. When I told him I was from Queens, his demeanor darkened. He started ranting about city folk ruining the area, littering and polluting. His frustration escalated into anger, and at one point he shouted, "I don't know why y'all can't just stay where the expletive you belong." Sensing the situation was getting out of hand, I calmly thanked him for the beer and left. As I walked away, he yelled, "I'm sorry." I acknowledged it with a thumbs up, but I was deeply unsettled. That night, while lying on a mattress watching a movie, I heard someone outside. The faint sound of muttering and cursing made my heart race. Looking out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The next day, Dale returned, knocking persistently on my door and calling my name. I ignored him, but his behavior was unsettling. That night, I heard a voice again. When I stepped onto the deck and turned on the light, I saw Dale standing in the woods staring at my home. He bolted as soon as the light hit him. I considered calling the police but decided against it after my dad advised me to hold off unless absolutely necessary. However, things escalated that night. Dale was outside, screaming angrily, "Nobody wants you here." I realized I might have made a mistake buying this property. I left the next day, taking my valuables with me. I haven't returned since, but if I do, it'll be with my family. If Dale continues his behavior, I won't hesitate to involve the authorities. For now, I'm weighing my options, including selling the property altogether. This experience has been terrifying, and I can't imagine going back there alone. I once had one of those moments that completely shook my sense of security regarding neighbors. At the time, I was 25 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood where I believed everyone looked out for one another. My neighbor, who lived next door, was a middle-aged man in his 40s. Let's call him Mike. He seemed friendly enough, occasionally joining my parties and bringing a six-pack or two. Mike had a son in the army, and we'd shared light conversations about military life and local news. There were no warning signs, nothing unusual about him. One night, I was heading to a friend's house but realized I'd forgotten something important. Turning back home, I pulled into my driveway only to see a figure jump over my backyard fence. Alarmed, I slowed down and watched as the figure darted behind Mike's barn, which was just a few feet away. Unsure of what to do, I sat in my car for a moment before deciding to confront the situation. I stepped out, pretending to have a loaded firearm, though the gun was actually inside my house. I shouted, demanding the person show themselves. Moments later, I saw Mike's silhouette rushing toward his back door. I knew it was him and felt a mix of anger and confusion. Determined to address it, I knocked on his front door. When he opened it, he looked confused. I confronted him about being in my backyard, but he denied everything, claiming he'd been inside all night. At first, I tried to keep things civil, suggesting that if he ever needed anything, he could simply ask. However, Mike became defensive and started hurling insults. It was clear he'd been drinking. I warned him that I kept a firearm in my house and wouldn't hesitate to protect myself if I caught anyone trying to break in. From that day on, Mike never spoke to me again. Things only got worse. I often noticed him peering from behind his curtains, watching me. Each time I returned home, I'd feel a pang of anxiety, wondering if he'd somehow gotten inside my house. Months later, he moved away and I felt a profound sense of relief. But this experience left me shaken. The person I'd thought of as a friendly neighbor turned out to be someone I couldn't trust, a reminder that sometimes we never really know who lives next door. It was 2 a.m., and a friend of mine was over at my house. We were still awake, chatting about random things, when we heard loud noises coming from outside. My friend joked, "Maybe someone's breaking into your car." Unfortunately, her joke turned out to be right. We rushed to the window and saw two figures near my car, though the darkness made it hard to make out details. My friend grabbed her phone to take pictures while I ran to grab mine, which was charging in another room. By the time I got back, she filled me in on what I missed. She described two men wearing hooded sweatshirts and dark clothing. They had pried open my car doors, smashed the windows, and scattered my belongings all over the ground. One of the thieves suddenly ran off, leaving the other behind to continue vandalizing my car. As I was about to call the police, I noticed my neighbor's car pulling out of his garage. The remaining thief finally fled, and we waited for the cops to arrive. When they did, we showed them the photos my friend had taken. The officers assured us they'd look into it and left after filing a report. As my friend and I were heading back inside, we saw my neighbor's car return and park in his garage. I pointed it out, considering whether it would be rude to ask him if he'd seen anything. My friend's face turned pale as she stopped me. She explained that the neighbor who had just arrived home was one of the men she had seen breaking into my car. I didn't want to believe it, but she insisted. His outfit, a dark hoodie, matched the blurry photo. My heart sank as we watched him casually walk out of his car and straight across the street to my house. Hidden in the shadows, we saw him approach my living room window and peer inside. Moments later, he returned to his house as if nothing had happened. I called the cops again, explaining that my neighbor was involved in the crime. When the officers came back, they knocked on his door, but he didn't answer. Despite knowing he was home, the police said there was nothing more they could do that night and would keep an eye on him. The following morning, after barely sleeping, I peered through the window. A note had been left on my car. It read, "Call me," followed by a phone number. I was furious and wanted to call him to confront him, but my friend convinced me it wasn't a good idea. Instead, I searched his number and address online. To my shock, he was a faculty member at one of the top schools in our city. I visited the police station several times over the next month, desperate for updates, but nothing ever came of it. The police seemed unable or unwilling to act. From then on, I avoided him. When he watered his plants or tended to his yard, I made sure to stay out of sight. What unsettled me the most was that he knew I knew, yet he acted as if nothing had ever happened. To this day, I have no idea why he targeted me or what his motive was. Living next to someone like that has left me in constant unease. A few months ago, my neighbor knocked on my door late one evening. I opened it to find her looking visibly distressed. She claimed she had locked herself out of her apartment and asked if she could borrow my phone to call her son. It seemed innocent enough, so I handed her my phone. She stepped just outside my door to make the call. I couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but her voice sounded calm and composed. After a few moments, she handed the phone back, thanked me, and left. The incident slipped from my mind until a week later. That's when the police showed up at my door asking to speak with me. Apparently, my phone number had been linked to a scam call targeting an elderly man. Someone had claimed to be his grandson, desperately in need of money. The poor man had sent thousands of dollars to a fake address before realizing he had been scammed. The officer asked me if I recognized the number that had been used. I didn't, but the timing of the scam coincided exactly with the evening my neighbor had borrowed my phone. When I mentioned this to the officer, they asked for her name and apartment number. I felt uneasy about reporting her, but what else could I do? The police thanked me and left to question her. I later learned from another neighbor that she had been arrested but released on bail within a few days. Things didn't go back to normal after that. I'd often catch her staring at my apartment door or lingering outside in the hallway. Once I came home to find a sticky note on my door. It read, "You'll regret this." I tried to brush it off as a scare tactic, but it didn't stop there. One night, I woke up to strange noises coming from my living room. When I went to investigate, I found my window slightly open. The curtains were swaying in the breeze, and I was sure I had locked it earlier. I moved out a month later. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that she's keeping tabs on me somehow. Driving for a ride-sharing app, I've had my fair share of strange encounters. But one ride from a few months ago stands out in a way I can't explain. It was late, close to midnight, when I got a request from an unfamiliar part of town. The area was quiet, with only the hum of distant traffic breaking the silence. As I pulled up to the pin location, a man stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, thin, and wore a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. He slid into the back seat without a word, and when I confirmed his destination, he only nodded. The ride was about 20 minutes, but the silence in the car was suffocating. I tried making small talk, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, his face partially obscured by the dim streetlights. About halfway through the ride, my phone started acting strange. The navigation app glitched, freezing and then rerouting me to random locations. Frustrated, I asked the man if he knew the area well enough to direct me. Without turning his head, he finally spoke. "Just keep going straight." His voice was low and hoarse, almost as if he hadn't spoken in years. When we reached what should have been the drop-off point, the area was completely desolate, a closed-down gas station with boarded-up windows and a rusting sign. I turned around to tell him we had arrived, but the back seat was empty. My heart raced as I stopped the car and looked around. There was no sign of him. Confused and shaken, I checked my rearview mirror again, but the seat was as empty as before. When I got home that night, I reviewed the trip details on the app. The ride was listed as canceled, and there was no record of the passenger or his pickup location. I haven't driven at night since. A few years ago, I moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed eager to get a tenant in, which should have been a red flag, but I was too desperate to care. The first few nights were uneventful. The place had a creaky floor and thin walls, but nothing I couldn't live with. Then, on the fourth night, I started hearing whispers. It began as faint murmurs coming from the wall near my bed. At first, I thought it was just my neighbors, but the whispers were oddly clear, like they were right next to me. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they were in a language I didn't recognize. Over the next few weeks, the whispers grew louder. They followed me around the apartment, shifting from one wall to another, even when I was in the shower. I began to notice other strange occurrences. Lights flickered without reason, and objects would be slightly out of place when I returned home. One night, as I sat in the living room trying to drown out the whispers with the TV, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence was so profound that it felt deafening. Then, all at once, the whispers came back, louder and more insistent, as if they were right inside my head. Panicked, I ran out of the apartment and didn't come back until morning. I finally told the landlord about the whispers. He gave me a long, uncomfortable look before saying, "You're not the first tenant to hear them. The last guy broke his lease after 3 months. I moved out that same week, breaking my own lease. Even now, I sometimes hear faint whispers when I'm alone, no matter where I am." Selling things online always comes with risks. You never know who's on the other side of the transaction, or what their real intentions are. I had used Craigslist plenty of times before without any issues, so when I decided to sell my old bike, Craigslist seemed like the obvious choice. I had outgrown the bike in more ways than one, but it was still in good condition, just not practical for the kind of biking I was doing now. I posted some pictures, wrote up a description, and set a fair price. Within a day, I got a response from someone named Jeffrey. He said he was interested and wanted to come by to take a look. Simple enough, right? I didn't think twice about inviting him over. I had done this before. Usually, people came, checked out the item, and either bought it or didn't. Easy. But this time was different. Jeffrey seemed eager, messaging me throughout the day with questions about the bike, how well it rode, if there were any problems, and when would be a good time to swing by. I answered everything, and we agreed he'd come by around 7 p.m. that evening. It was fall, so the sun was already setting, but I didn't mind the timing. Besides, I figured an evening sale might be easier since there'd be fewer people around, less noise, less hassle. My neighborhood was safe, or at least it had always felt that way. I was comfortable. I prepped the bike, cleaned it up a bit, and rolled it out into the front yard. It was one of those cooler evenings with a light breeze and that crisp smell of autumn in the air. I checked my phone. Jeffrey was on his way. A little after 7 p.m., a car pulled up in front of my house. Not just Jeffrey, 3 guys stepped out. The moment I saw them, I felt a pang of unease. Jeffrey hadn't mentioned bringing anyone with him, and none of them looked like the kind of person who'd be interested in a bike. They were big, broad-shouldered, and dressed casually. I tried not to judge too quickly. Maybe Jeffrey had just brought some friends along for the ride, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One of the guys waved at me as they approached, smiling. He introduced himself as Jeffrey, but his voice didn't match the casual tone of the messages. His smile felt forced. The other 2 guys hung back a bit, not saying anything. "Hey," Jeffrey said, his eyes scanning the bike. "This the one?" I nodded, trying to keep things light. "Yep, that's it. Just tuned it up yesterday. Want to take it for a spin." One of the guys stepped forward, looking at the bike like he didn't even care about it. He was more interested in the house, looking at the front door, then back at me. That's when the second guy spoke up. "Mind if I use your bathroom real quick?" That threw me off. I wasn't expecting anyone to ask to come inside, but it wasn't the first time someone had needed to use the bathroom during a sale, so I figured it wasn't that weird. "Sure," I said, motioning toward the door. "Just straight through the hallway." I kept my eyes on the 2 guys standing outside as the third one walked into the house. They were acting casual, but it felt forced, like they were waiting for something. Jeffrey kept talking about the bike, asking if it had been in any accidents, but I could tell he wasn't really interested in my answers. His eyes kept shifting between me and the house, like he was waiting for a signal. That's when I realized the guy who had gone inside had been gone way too long. I excused myself, telling Jeffrey I needed to check something real quick inside. The moment I stepped into the house, I noticed it was too quiet. No sound of footsteps, no flushing toilet, just silence. I walked through the hallway, past the bathroom, and saw the door was slightly ajar, empty. Panic hit me then. Where was he? I turned and headed toward the living room, my heart quickening as I searched the space. Then I saw a movement. The back door was slightly open, like someone had slipped out. I could feel my heart racing. I moved toward the door, not sure what I was going to find, when I heard the faintest creak from the floor above me. He was upstairs, and he had no reason to be there. I didn't think I just acted. I bolted toward the front door, adrenaline kicking in. As I reached the doorway, one of the guys stepped in front of me, blocking my exit. He didn't say anything, just stood there with this blank expression, his hands at his sides like he was ready to stop me if I tried to push past. "Everything all right, man?" Jeffrey asked from behind me, his voice calm but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "I think you guys should leave," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice wavered. Jeffrey took a step closer. "We're not done looking at the bike, are we?" My gut screamed at me to do something, but I was trapped, one guy in the house, another blocking the door, and Jeffrey closing in. I looked toward the staircase, hoping to catch sight of the third guy, but there was nothing. Just the growing realization that I had let these strangers into my house, and now I was paying for it. Suddenly I heard a loud thud from upstairs, followed by footsteps fast and heavy. Whoever was up there wasn't hiding anymore. Without thinking, I lunged for the side door leading to the garage. The guy blocking the front door moved to grab me, but I escaped. I sprinted through the garage, fumbling for the remote to open the overhead door. As it slowly cranked upward, I could hear footsteps behind me getting closer. The door wasn't even halfway up when I ducked and rolled under it, scraping my arms on the concrete as I scrambled to my feet. I heard the garage door slam shut behind me just as I burst into the driveway, running for my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, yelling for help, praying someone was home. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open and my neighbor, an older guy named Jack, stepped out. "They're in my house," I shouted. "Call the cops." The police arrived in minutes, but by the time they got there, the three men were gone. They had taken a few things, some cash, my wallet, and an old iPad I didn't use much. But the real loss was the sense of safety I'd always felt in my own home. The cops told me I was lucky, it could have been much worse. They had seen scams like this before, people posing as buyers to scope out houses, waiting for the right moment to rob, or worse. The fact that I had gotten out when I did probably saved me from something more dangerous. I spent the next few days on edge, jumping at every little noise. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't made that run for the garage. I never sold anything on Craigslist again. That bike? I gave it away for free.